Vladimir Putin has prepared a new wave of mobilization across Russia for a new offensive on Kyiv. Against the backdrop of the Kremlin's warning about preparing new waves of massive attacks on the Ukrainian capital, which may only be laying the groundwork. The Moscow Times reports that the Kremlin is on the verge of a large-scale mobilization for an offensive from the north, particularly on Kyiv. Russians are now receiving so-called mobilization orders en masse. This document clearly specifies the place and time for people liable for military service to report in the event of a general mobilization. In particular, this order is issued at military enlistment offices where Russians are summoned supposedly just to update their personal information. In Russia, this is already being called preparation for a general mobilization. At the same time, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, called the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, on May 25 and told him that the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, had ordered the army to regularly shell Kyiv. And now experts are already saying that these shellings can be seen as an attempt to either create a foothold or an attempt to create such an impression. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, please subscribe to this YouTube channel, like this episode, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pichi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So the Moscow Times reports that in recent months, Russian citizens have been increasingly receiving so-called mobilization notices. Mobilization orders when visiting military enlistment offices where they are summoned to update their information or through electronic summons. The point is that everything looks like just a data check, but in reality the enlistment offices warn that soon they will need to come again. And I'll note here that it was previously reported that, by the way, Russians are no longer being allowed into Belarus. Because before that they first check the information to see if the draft office is looking for them. And as the publication writes, this is evidenced by statistics from search queries in Google and Yandex, as well as information from lawyers. Google started recording a surge in searches for the keyword mobilization notice at the end of March, and the peak was reached in early April. As a result, queries like "they pasted in a mobilization notice, what should I do? How long is a mobilization notice valid?" or "red mobilization notice" have become extremely popular on Google Trends. At the same time, Yandex WordStat recorded Russians' interest in the same term, mobilization notice, since the fall of last year, and then detected an almost fourfold increase in such queries during the winter and early spring. And here I need to explain, this mobilization notice is issued based on the decision of the Municipal Draft Board. It contains instructions on what a citizen should do in the event of a general mobilization, where and when to report, and what to bring with them. Usually the order is pasted or inserted directly into the military ID. A lot of summonses are now being sent to so-called reservists. They are most often summoned supposedly to update their information and less often for a medical examination. And when they show up, they try to stick this mobilization notice into their documents, persuade them to join the reserve or sign a contract. And back in February, human rights activists in Russia reported that military IDs were being confiscated from employees of one of the major companies, followed by the issuance of draft notices and an offer to insert a mobilization notice. In March, the administration of the village of Novoromanovo in the Altai region posted lists. They required men with military IDs to appear in order to receive mobilization notices. Conscripts from Novosibirsk and the Chelyabinsk region also reported about the insertion of the orders. A representative of one of the conscripts said that the conscription offices are now, quoting him, working according to orders, checking everyone and adding people to the group of those who may be useful to the army. He called this preparation for general mobilization and the selection of candidates. Well, against this background, let me remind you that just yesterday, on May 25, Vladimir Putin finally signed a law that significantly expands his powers to use the armed forces abroad. According to the document, from now on, the balding dictator Vladimir Putin will be able to deploy the army to protect Russian citizens in the event of their arrest, detention, criminal or other prosecution abroad. This refers to cases when Russians are arrested abroad by courts that have authority without the participation of the Russian Federation, as well as by international judicial bodies that Russia does not recognize, and all of this is stated in the explanatory note to this law. The relevant amendments are being made to the federal laws on citizenship and on defense. Currently, Putin can send troops abroad if other countries or international bodies make decisions that run counter to Russia's interests in Russia. And so, the Russian authorities decided to expand Putin's powers regarding the use of the army abroad after a series of warnings from leading NATO countries that the Kremlin is preparing for open war with one or several European countries. In the summer, the head of German intelligence warned about the risk of a Russian provocation in the Baltic states. In February, Danish intelligence stated that Russia is capable of starting a full-scale war in Europe within the next 5 years. But the so-called zero phase of preparation for such a war has already begun in Russia, and the Institute for the Study of War wrote about this back in October. According to experts, this is evidenced by the reorganization of military districts on Russia's western border and the creation of military bases on the border with Finland, as well as sabotage, interference with electronic warfare systems, GPS jamming, arson, and provocations in the air. At the same time, on May 25, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and told him that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the army to regularly shell the Ukrainian capital Kyiv. Lavrov said, quote, "In response to Ukraine's terrorist attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure on Russian territory, the armed forces of the Russian Federation are beginning systematic and consistent strikes on Kyiv. The targets will be facilities used for the needs of the Ukrainian armed forces and decision-making centers. That's why Lavrov urged Marco Rubio to urgently evacuate diplomatic personnel and other U.S. citizens from the Ukrainian capital." By the way, today at the American Embassy in Kyiv, they stated that Vladimir Putin is once again just trying to intimidate everyone and spread panic. But in the West, they already understand very well what this dwarf, the little bald dictator Vladimir Putin, is like, so he won't succeed in intimidating anyone. In addition, Lavrov mentioned the summit between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Anchorage in August 2025. And he expressed regret that, quote, "The pushy efforts of the European elites and the Ukrainian leadership are undermining the progress achieved during that meeting toward a sustainable long-term settlement in Ukraine." Let me also remind you that earlier on Monday, the Russian Foreign Ministry announced new shelling of Kyiv. This happened the day after a massive attack on the city using hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles, including the Oreshnik missile. At the same time, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation has already presented the massive shelling of Kyiv on May 24 as an alleged response to Ukraine's terrorist attacks on civilian targets, and as retribution for the strike on Starobelsk, which the Russians themselves made up. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine denies carrying out a strike on a student dormitory in the Luhansk region. They say they only targeted Russian military sites like ammo depots, air defenses, command posts, and the Rubicon drone unit HQ. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to give a like. If you want to support the work of the armed forces, hit the bell and don't forget to give a like if you want to support this work. YouTube denies any impact on student props in the description to this video. And finally, I'll add that I appeared exclusively in the Luhansk region. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine denies striking a student dormitory in Luhansk.